Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. On today's episode, we will be continuing part 5 of the India series by discussing the partition of Bengal and the Amritsar Massacre, two key events in the Indian independence movement that fueled the fight for independence. By 1857, India had become a country in crisis. Rebellions were frequent occurrences, and oppression often followed from the British end. During this back-and-forth contest between Indian freedom fighters and the British government took place perhaps one of the biggest regional splits in Indian history, the partition of Bengal. Ever since the British had arrived in India, the state of Bengal had always been one of much dispute. According to the British, the partition of Bengal had several justified causes. Firstly, Britain argued that splitting Bengal would allow them to easily rule both provinces, since Bengal had become overly populous and thus hard to govern. Splitting the state into two distinct regions would allow the British government to exert more direct influence over both provinces, instead of struggling to control one. Furthermore, one underlying cause of the British partition of Bengal was their desire to divide and rule. Ever since Britain had conquered India, they aimed to increase tensions between Hindus and Muslims by pitting them against each other and then taking the winning side. Thus, dividing Bengal, which was one of the most religiously diverse regions in India, would allow increased conflict between Bengali Hindus and Bengali Muslims. Britain also aimed to weaken the overall state of Bengal, since it was a national hotspot. Honored freedom fighters such as Subhas Chandra Bose, Swami Vivekananda, and Rabindranath Tagore all hailed from Bengal. So splitting Bengal would, theoretically, weaken support for the independence movement. Combined, these factors appealed to the British Crown and allowed the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, to conduct the partition. On October 16, 1905, the Indian province of Bengal was split into two sides, East Bengal and West Bengal. The results of this partition were long-lasting. First off, the partition led to the forced migration of thousands of Bengalis. As East Bengal was majority Muslim, thousands of Hindus migrated to West Bengal, and vice versa. Immediately, anti-British movements fueled, such as the Swadeshi movement, which encouraged Indians to boycott British goods and promote Indian-owned businesses. This movement aimed to increase Indian self-sufficiency and to show Britain that India wasn't dependent on its economic production to run successfully. Furthermore, the partition, which aimed at increasing national divide amongst Indians, had the opposite effect. Thousands of Indians, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Jains, and Christians alike, joined forces to rebel against British oppression. Bengali poets rose during this time period, who advocated for a distinctive Bengali identity and instilled nationalism amongst their followers. The partition of Bengal, what Britain had hoped to make Indian colonization easier for themselves, had instead become the fuel to the fire of Indian independence. In 1911, after 6 long years of protests and rebellions, the Indians gained victory, as the British government was forced to repeal the partition and reunify Bengal, acknowledging the strength of the Indian masses. And although the reunification of Bengal could be seen as the solution to the disastrous partition, what followed was largely what the British had hoped for: rising tensions between Hindus and Muslims. In 1906, around the same time as the partition of Bengal, the All India Muslim League was founded in East Bengal under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who would go on to be the first Prime Minister of Pakistan in 1947. The League was created in an effort to protect Muslim interests, as Jinnah and his followers believed that Hindus were becoming the more favorable candidates for government jobs, depriving Muslims of employment and economic safety. The All India Muslim League is seen as one of the earliest signs of Hindu-Muslim conflict in British India. As political parties and nationalism spurred in India throughout the early 1900s, a major massacre erupted just 8 years after the reunification of Bengal, that is largely known as the most brutal event of Indian colonization history. That is the Amritsar Massacre of 1919. To understand the Amritsar Massacre, it is important to be familiar with the Rowlatt Act of 1919. This act prohibited Indians from getting a trial by jury, which limited self-expression and freedom of speech. The act was met with widespread resentment and protests across India, especially in the province of Punjab. Throughout this protesting period, Gandhi continued to advocate for non-violent protests, but his suggestions were hardly applied. In Amritsar, 2 prominent independence leaders were arrested on April 10, 1919, for leading the protests against the Rowlatt Act. This caused increased resentment in Punjab, leading to increased gatherings and protests. On April 13th, the day of the Baisakhi festival, thousands of people gathered to peacefully protest and celebrate the harvesting season. British General Reginald Dyer, who was at the park as the officer in charge, saw the gathering as a violent gathering and ordered his troops to open fire on the unarmed crowd. Dyer's troops mercilessly fired for about 10 minutes, and as people tried to climb the park's walls to escape, they were shot down, becoming nothing more than a pile of bodies in a matter of a couple minutes. British forces reported 379 deaths and 1,200 injuries, though Indian accounts estimate a much larger number, approximately 1,000 dead and thousands more injured. In the 10 minutes of relentless firing, the British government had become single-handedly responsible for one of the most violent massacres in the history of colonization. The massacre greatly intensified the Indian independence movement, largely from an emotional and humanitarian perspective. Indians had begun to view the British as monsters who had no value for human lives and were governing India solely to exploit the Indian people. Even Mahatma Gandhi, who was a strict advocate of nonviolence, now fought for complete self-rule and launched the non-cooperation movement. Soon, news of the massacre had spread internationally, receiving widespread criticism. The British government launched an inquiry called the Hunter Commission, which temporarily criticized Dyer's actions, but no severe action was taken. Both the partition of Bengal and the Amritsar Massacre were 2 of the most intense and horrid events in Indian colonial history that have continued to shape the social and political dynamics of Bengal, Punjab, Hindu-Muslim relations, and Indian internal affairs. Although the British led both events in an effort to break the Indian spirit, the resilience and determination won in the end, and ensured that the Indian independence movement would live on for the remainder of British colonialism. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to stay tuned every other Friday. On the next episode, we will be covering India's road to freedom, covering topics such as the life and legacy of Subhas Chandra Bose, the Indian National Army, and the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Until then, keep listening to Fine Print and keep reading between the lines.